That is Scapa Flow. And at one point in time, 52 German warships were sunk there over the course of only several hours. Today, only 8 remain, but that's not the weird part. The weird part is that those German ships were sunk by the Germans. This was done not during the war, in this case World War I, but 7 months after, in one afternoon. Those 52 ships were sunk, 9 sailors would be shot and killed, another 16 wounded, and a German admiral would become a hero in his homeland. Admiral Ludwig von Reuter had a problem. The war was over, and Germany had lost. The armistice was signed in November of 1918, and there would be no more fighting. But that wasn't a problem, that was probably a relief. Only a month prior, mutinies had been occurring on ships on the German High Seas Fleet, after they had received an order to attack the British Grand Fleet in one last desperate attempt to force the war into a stalemate, or at least get more favorable negotiations. Most of the sailors saw this as a suicide mission that would make an already unwinnable war even longer, and many historians cite this as one of the first moments in the German Revolution that would eventually collapse the empire, the abdication of the Kaiser, and the end of the German nobility. But that wasn't Admiral von Reuter's issue. The problem was that having lost the war, concessions were expected from Germany and its allies. Those concessions would be ironed out in the preceding months at the Paris Peace Conference, eventually culminating in the Versailles Treaty in June of 1919. But between November 1918 and June 1919, the German High Seas Fleet was to be interred here at Scapa Flow, a harbor in the Orkney Islands of Scotland. Von Reuter wasn't supposed to be in charge of commanding the fleet into this sea prison, but the man who was, Admiral Franz von Hipper, refused. So what was Admiral von Reuter to do? Well, he followed his orders, and 176 German U-boats and ships were to be surrendered to the Allies. Of those, von Reuter led 74 into Scapa Flow, guarded by the British battle cruiser force. This is somewhat of an insult since the terms were agreed that a neutral harbor would be used. But that's what happens when you lose. You concede. All he could do now was maintain as much honor as possible throughout the whole ordeal. Scapa Flow has been a safe harbor for thousands of years. The Vikings used it to keep their longboats safe while they explored the Scottish Isles and the North Sea. The British used it throughout their history to protect their fleets from the elements, and now Admiral von Reuter was sailing his fleet into it so that the British could keep a watchful eye of the commandeered force. 370 British, French, and American ships would accompany them in a kind of maritime victory parade. Since the final concessions were still being worked out, the Brits were unable to officially claim the ships, but the Germans were instructed to lower their flags, remove the breech blocks from their weapons, rendering their armament useless, and wait until word was given to relinquish the fleet. The ships were only allowed a skeleton crew to keep them floating, with the rest being taken to the mainland. With that, their floating imprisonment began. It was almost common knowledge by now that these ships would be seized by the Allies one way or another, whether by treaty or by force. The U-boats had already been agreed to be relinquished to the Allies in their entirety, but the surface fleet's fate was still in question. Admiral Adolf von Trotha had instructed von Reuter that he couldn't allow the fleet to be commandeered by any means. This was less of a threat than it was a request to appear. Both men knew that giving up their warships to the enemy would result in a situation that left Germany helpless in the future, as the Allied navies would be far better suited for a future conflict. France and Italy both wanted a quarter of the ships available, whereas the British wanted them all destroyed in order to maintain their naval superiority over everyone. The rumor of scuttling grew louder and louder as the Paris Peace Accords began to culminate. Von Reuter had already discussed with his staff that should the German government agree to give up the fleet, that was their disgrace and not his or his officers. But should he expect the Allies to attempt to seize the ships, the order to scuttle would be given. On board the interred ships, the skeleton crew was steadily reduced. through repatriation back to Germany. Demoralized, without fresh food or rations, and living in filth, attitudes were as low as one would expect. Officers' orders would be vetted by a sailors' committee before execution. As the months went on, these sailors, who had participated in or sympathized with the mutinous actions months prior, were steadily chosen and removed from the ships. This was a calculated plan because Admiral von Reuter needed loyal men to carry out his secret plan. Meanwhile, the British were starting to get suspicious that the Germans were going to sink the fleet, despite the fact that von Reuter's plan was to do so only under the prerequisites that the British would attempt to commandeer them before the final treaty concessions were worked out. Due to this, the British began forming plans to genuinely seize the ships in order to prevent the scuttling. In a way, they were essentially shooting themselves in the foot. Tensions were building as the expectation was that the treaty would be signed on June 21st, 1919, and then the week preceding, news began to flow about the plans coming from both sides. The Brits were even organizing boarding parties to investigate if preparations had already been made to scuttle, which, coincidentally, had already been done by the Germans. Those loyal German sailors had turned flood valves to within a few millimeters of being open, lubricated them heavily, placed hammers and clubs near water pipes. They had loosened portholes and wedged watertight doors that were meant to prevent sinking wide open. They would be ready at a moment's notice. And that notice came quickly. The signing of the treaty was pushed back to the 23rd. But rumor had made its way to the Admiral that the Brits were going to seize the ships on the night of the 23rd in order to prevent their destruction, with the treaty signed or not, as the armistice would officially be over. Unable to board the ships for inspection due to the fact that the British had mission requirements for exercising their own fleet, the Germans were left in Scapa Flow alone on the day of 21 June, while the British sailed out to sea for training. This was ideal because the only ships left to guard the Germans were 2 active destroyers, 7 trawlers, and a group of smaller boats. The signal was given at 10 a.m. to prepare to scuttle, having previously been discussed amongst the crews. With the weight of the entire German naval fleet on his shoulders, Admiral von Reuter gave the command to scuttle via flag signal at 11:20 a.m. Those valves, set within a millimeter of open, were cranked to their stops. Water pipes were smashed and flood valves released. For about half an hour, not much happened. The first of the ships began to list to one side at about the hour mark, and more followed. Each ship raised the colors of Imperial Germany one last time, and the abandoned ship order was given once the sinking of each respective ship was guaranteed. The British fleet out at sea got word and immediately set to return, but was hours away. The few boats left in Scapa Flow did their best to ram the sinking ships into sandbars and prevent their sinking, but only managed to prevent one of the capital ships from going under. Its small crew too insufficient to introduce enough water to flood it. By the time the Hindenburg, the last big ship to go under at 5 p.m., was assuredly lost, 52 of the 74 ships had disappeared beneath the surface, with the rest either unable to be scuttled or beached by those small British boats. During the scuttling, over 1,700 German sailors piled into lifeboats and made their way to shore, knowing that they would essentially be prisoners of war at that time. The chaos that was unfolding, though, led to confusion as to how to handle this situation by some of the British units. What resulted is some took it to the extreme, opening fire on the unarmed Germans, claiming they were instructed to use any and all levels of force to prevent the scuttling. 9 German sailors would be killed, 16 wounded, the last casualties of the war. Admiral Ludwig von Reuter and all of his officers were apprehended as prisoners of war. Aboard the HMS Revenge, they looked on emotionless as British Admiral Fremantle denounced them for their actions. Afterwards in private, Fremantle would say he was almost sympathetic to the man for having to make such a difficult decision. Despite their anger and disappointment at his actions, there is usually a common understanding amongst servicemen that can appreciate maintaining as much honor and dignity as possible when placed in extreme situations. When the news hit the German populace, von Reuter became famous for protecting what little pride was left of the German people. After a brief imprisonment in Britain, he would return a hero. Despite this, though, Due to the drastic reduction in the fleet size allowed to Germany after the Treaty of Versailles, Admiral von Reuter would return to a navy that had no position for him. He was regrettably asked to resign almost exactly a year after the scuttling, being too old and too high of rank to have a job in the now diminished branch. He would go on to be a state counselor and authored a book that described the events of the scuttling, eventually passing away from a heart attack in 1943. The story didn't end with the scuttling of the fleet itself, now mostly resting at the bottom of Scapa Flow. Salvage operations commenced almost immediately, and the economy here in the Orkneys was heavily cushioned by the income generated supporting those operations. Several dozen of the ships were salvaged during the 1920s and 30s, sold for scrap or retrofitted as targets for Allied naval training. Only 7 remain at the bottom of Scapa Flow today, and they're a popular diving destination here in the Orkneys. Scapa Flow saw additional activity during the Second World War. Block ships, boats sunk to prevent entrance to the harbor by German U-boats, had existed since World War I. In conjunction with mining and patrols, this kept the harbor relatively safe. During World War II, though, German U-boat U-47 snuck past these defenses and destroyed several ships, killing over 800 British sailors in one attack before escaping. Winston Churchill himself went to the Orkneys to bolster the defense, directing causeways to be built between some of the smaller islands, additional block ships, and more patrols to protect the fleet. Those causeways are referred to as Churchill barriers today, and several of the block ships can still be seen nearby. Check out another video here. Thanks for watching. Thanks to my Patreon subscribers for helping me get here. And as always, until next time, get lost.